Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm speaking with Leanne Tritton, who is a super interesting person that's been in and around the property space for many years. And amongst other things, I will be talking about an organisation she's involved in called Don't Waste Buildings, lots of other interesting stuff. So I'll see you on the inside. Right, just a quick one. Whether you are a massively experienced and well-established property developer already, or maybe you're a new or aspiring one, either way, you will know that it is really not easy to find viable opportunities to come up with the best scheme, the best design that's going to maximise the land value and fully de-risk things for you, and then to go on to get the very best planning permissions as quickly as possible. However experienced you are, you will know that that is not an easy thing. I have put together a super detailed scorecard based on my 40 years experience in this industry, reverse engineering everything that I've learned, including lots and lots of mistakes over the years, and everything I've done to maintain, touch wood, 100% planning track record. I'm pretty sure there will be stuff that you don't know. Go and do that scorecard. Find out just how good or not your current process is, and I absolutely guarantee you will learn at least a little something, if not a ton. So it's bit.ly/MLA score, all in capitals. You can do the Millbank Land Academy scorecard. I absolutely guarantee you will find some interesting stuff, and it will help you get much better deals. Leanne, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Okie dokie. Well, what I usually do with these things is before I start is where you're from, how you got started.
As of June the 5th, I'll have been in the UK for 30 years. So I moved over here from Australia in 1995. And I had been working in sort of marketing and PR and promotions in a range of different places. So I worked for a theme park, Australia's Wonderland, which is Yogi Bear and dress-up characters. And then I worked for the Australian Jockey Club, which is a horse racing organisation in Sydney. And then I worked for a film and television company called Southern Star, which is now Endemol. And they made Australian television programs and then sold them around the world. So I decided to move to London. I'd always wanted to live in London. So I moved here in 1995, and I knew nothing about sort of the formal part of the built environment. My dad was obsessed by houses, and I was thinking about it coming up today because as kids, in the 70s in Australia, you didn't do much on weekends except you did sport and you didn't go out to things like you do now. But Dad would load us all into the car and we used to drive around housing estates looking at new builds. And we'd get out and we'd walk around and, Dad was a great dreamer and he'd be sort of looking at, what type of timber they were using and the foundations were like and sort of guessing what rooms they were going to be using for what purpose. So I spent a lot of time in the carcasses of houses that were being built, for fun. But I moved here in 95, met an architectural photographer called Grant Smith, and he introduced me to the world of architecture. And of course, I'd never been exposed to that at all in Australia. That led on to understanding the whole world of the built environment. So that's this very, very short history of how I got here. But I set up an agency, a comms agency in 1999 called Ing Media. At the beginning, we were doing all sorts of things. So we launched Peppa Pig. We were doing sustainable fish from Shetland Islands. We launched Pho, the restaurant, and Chilango, which is a burrito sort of brand. So we did everything. I mean, I was hugely enthusiastic about any sort of new business. But we had started working with architects, and the penny really dropped for me when I went to MIPIM for the first time, because it was at MIPIM that I saw this massive ecosystem of how stuff gets built. So, you have all of these people together, sort of 20, 25,000 people, and they're architects or they're engineers or they're policy people or planners or finance people. And that's when the penny dropped for me that where we could take Ing, that if you could be the agency who understood this world and was able to navigate it all, you could have a very good business. And that proved to be correct. Ing has grown to about 50 people, and I sold the business to the team as employee ownership, and stepped away from day-to-day running of that in July 23. So since then, I've had the sort of luxury of spending a lot of time actually figuring out how things work or don't work in our sector. And I know that sounds a bit odd, but when you're working and your day-to-day is so busy, and you get all these reports through, and someone's launched a white paper, and then there's a new policy document, you sort of take the top line, but you don't have a lot of time to really get into the weeds of things. And so that's what I've been doing, and getting sort of excited and frustrated in equal measure about where we can take this industry and how we need to convince politicians and convince the public that most of us are here for good, not for bad.
You've got some really interesting ideas, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute. But interestingly, when you were talking about MIPing, you didn't mention developers.
Oh, of course, developers. Sorry, that's the obvious. It was interesting with MIPIM as well. And I think that sort of speaks to the differences of the sectors that I've worked in, because I'd actually been to Cannes many times before I went to MIPIM for a television program show, or sales show really, called MIP TV. And even the Cannes Film Festival is about sales. I mean, people think it's all about red carpet and everything else, but essentially behind the scenes, people are doing deals and selling programs and everything else. And, going to a trade show to sell your wares or make connections with other people in your industry is pretty standard for any sector. Doesn't matter what sector you're in. Someone goes to a trade show. But I think for the world of architecture and sometimes the built environment, it takes on a whole different meaning. And I know lots of people who think, oh God, I've got to go to MIPIM. It's so tawdry and I don't want to go there to, sell my soul. But there's nothing wrong with going and meeting like-minded people and finding like-minded people to do business in a better way. I've always been hugely enthusiastic about MIPIM and what it can do for businesses and how you can meet people in this amazing world of technology that we have, and online and everything else. There is nothing that will ever beat meeting someone face to face and building a relationship and building that trust. And that's what you get from whether it's MIPIM or there's an event next week called UK Reef, which is the same concept, really. It's I think all of these things get dressed up in lots of ways, but essentially it's a forum where you can go and meet people face to face and build relationships, and that's it.
Interesting. I want to jump back to something again. So you mentioned some people said, oh God, I don't want to go, a bit of resistance and stuff like that. I'll tell you what I've sort of noticed over the years. Maybe this is wrong. Has just been my perception. In property and property development in particular, there's always, it seemed to me, been a little bit of a sort of us and them, or like the developers are the baddies.
Absolutely. And I think there is a sense of our sector is very tribal. So and you've got more experience than anyone else, but you go into a project meeting and there will be all of the people around the table who are all trying to get a project over the line. So the developer, the architect, the investor, the engineers, the policy people. And yet when you leave that meeting, everyone sort of retreats into their own corners and their own sort of tribal, stereotypes in some ways. And I think the smart operators understand that it takes many hands and you've got to be able to engage with all the different groups. But there are some people who think all developers are bad, and then there are also people who think that architects can be a pain, and that's not true either. So I think everybody has their prejudices about what the other group does. Similarly with public sector professionals, they're often seen as they're the blockers. And again, sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. That's why it's so important to be able to weed out and find the stars you can work with and bring projects over the line with.
That's excellent. And in fact, it's one of the main reasons for me starting this podcast, actually, is because I wanted to have conversations like this so that all of the various people involved in the sector, and that's a lot of, lots of people, all the people, you've mentioned policymakers, planners, all of the various consultants, obviously developers, there's a lot of people involved. I think very often it's been very siloed. They've all been sort of like living in their own little worlds, focused on their bit, which obviously, they need to, because they need to know exactly how it all works. But it's not been very joined up, and there's not been a lot of understanding about how it all fits together.
That's spot on. And I think one of the things that is so positive about this sort of new age of communication is, I mean, personally, I absolutely love podcast formats, because I've spent my life in the media world where, first of all, as a PR person back in the day when I first started, journalists or editors were the gatekeepers. They decided what was publicized or not. So you had two ways of getting in a newspaper or a trade magazine. And that was, in those days, it was either advertising, so you paid for the advertising and that worked or it didn't, or it was PR or influence. So, you would take a story to a journalist and pitch it to them, and then they would decide whether they thought it was worthy or not. And of course, I think that, now that we're in this environment, that really narrowed how you got profile. So, most of the trade publications in sort of our world generally focused on the big players, the really, really big players, because, that's the news hook. And from, all publications, and I'm not going to single one out, all of those publications would do regional supplements from time to time. And that was great. But that meant if you were, say, a regional developer, you got one chance a year to get some publicity or get known for what you were doing. Now, that's not very much. Whereas now you are a great example of this. You're in control of your own destiny, because you can just publish your own information, your own podcast, and get that information out. And things like LinkedIn and everything else, I think, have been enormously helpful for smaller operators to be able to get their message out. And it'll change again. It'll keep changing. But we no longer have that situation where it is controlled by a small group of people. I'll tell you just a quick story of back in the day. I know it's always boring, people going back in my day.
It's not boring. I like stories. I was going to ask you if you've got any good stories, so it's all good.
I did this course, sort of a nighttime course. And in those days, I mean, I'm so old that it was, you sent your press releases in the mail. Okay. So you signed off the press release, and then you folded it up, put it in an envelope, stamped it, and sent it off. So, things didn't move quickly in terms of announcing news. And I was told that, one of the most effective ways to get in front of a journalist was to always print your press releases on coloured paper, so that when they sat in their inbox, yours would stand out. MIP TV, which is the television equivalent of MIPM. In those days, if you wanted to find a journalist, and no, journalists didn't have bylines and photos like you do now, and you didn't know anything about them. They would just be these sort of stars that you had to try and get to know. And particularly if you were trying to find out about a UK-based journalist from Australia, there was no internet or anything to find that. At the press room, there was just this massive, massive wall of pigeonholes, and you would stand, and each person had a name on their pigeonhole. And so as a young PR person, I would have to stand next to the pigeonholes, waiting and watching to see if some bloke would come along and, go to his pigeonhole. And then I'd go, oh, that's that person. So you literally, that's how you found out about journalists. So it was very, very tough to infiltrate that world. And I think we're much more democratic now with social media and everything else. Obviously, it's got its downsides, but I think people forget how positive it's been in the way we can communicate and connect with people so much more easily than we used to. I mean, people were not open to connection. You had to know someone, and you had to be invited into that sort of world. Whereas now, if I want to connect with someone, I just find them on LinkedIn, send them a message, and 9 times, not an AI generated message, I have to say, but a proper message. And 9 times out of 10, people are always open for a chat.
Interesting. You mentioned other people's podcasts, or you like the format. Got any good ones?
I tell you what I'm doing at the moment. I'm not going to name them because I could get in trouble politically. But after I was in Canada when Trump got elected, and the night before the election, we were having dinner with family, and I was, adamant that Trump was not going to win. And I read a lot. I consume a lot of media. I read the FT, the Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian every morning, and I look at all sorts of other publications, and I try and have a broad spectrum. But when he won, I can remember when the polls closed, and it was so clear it was just a landslide. And I was kind of angry to a certain degree about the media I'd been consuming because they'd all got it so wrong. And I thought, how can I be, fairly well informed and still so far off the mark? So I have spent a lot of time over the last sort of 6 months or so trying to find podcasts and content that is different to how I think, to try and understand what is going on. And it's really interesting. I don't think that the sides of politics are actually that different than we think they are. I think there is a general sense, not only in the UK, but in the States, in Australia, that things are not working properly.
Yeah.
The government, there's, this lack of trust from most people that, I've paid my taxes, I've done the right thing, I'm trying my best, and it's still not working. And I think that's something that underpins so many conversations that we have. So that's what I'm trying to do. I listened recently to Ezra Klein and Jon Stewart, from the Daily Show fame. They were talking about the concept of abundance, and they were going through on this particular episode, sort of step by step blockers to, I think it was getting 5G in the US. And anyone who's in our world has to listen to it because you'll scream and be sort of, I guess, feel a bit better that it's also happening over there in equal measure. But it's this idea that lots of good people over the years have just added extra layers. When something goes wrong, our first instinct, I think, is to add a layer to stop something going wrong again. But in fact, what we've done is created so many layers that the only people who've got the appetite, I think, to break through that system are people with very, very deep pockets. So I think you on your podcast, you're often talking about the difficulty of small SME developers, SME builders to break through. And that's because it's just so hard. And it's not just hard from the planning and all of those sorts of regulations and everything else. It's hard on the heart. I think if you run a business, what you need to have when you don't have money coming through the door or you don't have success, you need those wins, don't you? Those little gateways to encourage you to keep going.
You do.
And if your heart and soul is battered at every single step, you give up.
You can only take so many kickings before it starts getting you down a bit, to be honest.
Exactly. And I think people underestimate that part of it. So our conversations are very much with, SME developers or people in our sector. It's all about, the planning process and everything else, and that will fix. But unless people can see success, it's not like there are loads and loads of developers all trying and failing. What's happened is actually we've pushed so many people out of the market because it's too hard. And I think that's something that the government has to understand. I guess the mindset of entrepreneurs, they're a different breed, and it's and they're so important because people with an entrepreneurial spirit are fantastic at jumping over barriers. We're a bit pig-headed, aren't we? So it's you need people like us to just keep going, but you've got to give a carrot from time to time to keep us keep us on the straight and narrow.
What really doesn't help is, like, obviously there are rubbish developers out there, just like there's rubbish architects and rubbish everything else, right? But there are also very good ones. I've got to tell you, when it's really, really hard, and not only is it really hard, you got a lot of people out there thinking you're a greedy arsehole as well.
Yeah.
It doesn't help, because there are some greedy arseholes. And again, the sooner people can sort of understand that, and look, I'm never going to expect people to feel sorry for property developers, but at the end of the day, particularly the small ones, they are the ones that are going to have to build the houses that we need,
Yeah.
Because again, if you leave it just to all of the big boys, you get all of the stuff that everyone complains about, identikit housing estates, etc. Now, I'm not saying that all the big ones are bad, by the way, but the thing that's going to create really good design and buildings and homes and communities is lots more SME developers, I think.
One of the things that I'm slightly critical with our sectors, is that we do very, very little sort of broad brush promotion of the sector, as you say. So these stereotypes get hooked in because most of the news is not a public service for our industry, by the way. People who run newspapers, they are also running a business. News is just content for most people, except the BBC. Everyone else is trying to make money out of selling news. So it's always has been. We're all guilty of opening up the paper and going, "Oh my God, I wouldn't. Why is that? That's not news." You just have to read the comment section. But it is for lots of people. So the bad stuff does get into the news more often than the good. But how you counter that is by promoting your industry in a sophisticated way and also a well-funded way. So most industries actually have big groups that do sort of funded marketing programs, whether that's through PR or through advertising or whatever. Our sector does none of that.
No.
And so it's very, very difficult to rely on individual companies to change the perception of an industry on your own. You've developed your development. You've got enough on your plate with selling those houses, making sure the development is absolutely the best it can be, without also having the layer of responsibility to change how the industry is seen by the broader public. But we do have trade associations, and they should be doing more of that. And I think that the general public, and actually most politicians, don't understand how any of this works.
But again, they really don't, which was one of the reasons for doing this, so that they can start getting how it works. Because they, I know lots of people think, oh, it's just, greedy developers and all the rest of it. Honestly, it goes up and down in cycles, but it's really not easy to make money in this business, certainly not as an SME, which is why there's been such a decline in them.
Yeah. And the other thing is, so when we talk about developers, the one thing that everyone knows, we need more houses, but who builds them? Who makes that happen? It's not like they're magicked up. So there is this massive disconnect between the perception of what the developer does and actually our demand. We want more houses, we want brilliant houses, we want them beautiful, but we sort of don't want developers to do it. Well, who is going to do it?
Yeah. Because
the government is not building anything. So it has to have a tighter relationship. And I think there is some of the leadership in politics, I think, has been negligent as well in not, everything becomes about politics. And so it's an easier thing, isn't it, to say it's the greedy developer than it is about understanding how the industry works. But again, everything's a two-sided coin. I think we don't do enough as an industry, to really hunt down and talk to people in their own language as well. Make it simple. I've been sort of on the PR and comm side of this industry for 25 years now. But even I, you're listening to things and going, "Oh God, what's that? I don't know what that means." So you got to get home and Google it. So for the average person in the street, they're going to have no hope unless we learn how to talk normally and consistently, not just when we're coming in to do a development. But that's where you need the overarching, I think, support of the industry groups.
There are, particularly for SMEs, there are. I will name them actually. So you've got the HBF, obviously the Home Builders Federation is the sort of the biggest one, who are great, but again, they're busy dealing with policy stuff and it's constantly changing, and that's a full-time job. Without, I suppose, having tons and tons of time to go just promoting the industry as well. So anyway, it's a tricky one. You must have dealt with lots of good developers or come across some good developers over the years that are a bit of an exemplar.
I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but they sort of fall into two groups, really. And what concerns me at the moment is you do have some really amazing developers who really care with great, great detail about how their places look and feel. And then there are people who care less and are much more technocratic about how things work. And, it's this constant tension, I think, about leadership styles. So the property developer of the sort of 80s and 90s was always, these huge sort of silverback characters who were hugely charismatic and, it's my way or the highway, but they got a lot of stuff done. I think now a lot of the major developers or property companies are becoming a little bit anonymous and a little bit too technocratic. So you hear people constantly talk about assets, asset management, numbers of units, delivery, all of these sorts of things. You don't really hear that much about people or about the product itself. I mean, I live now just not far from Corby, and I worked in Corby in the 2000s with Catalyst Corby, which is the urban regeneration company. And there's a guy called Bob Lane, who was the civil servant who was the chief executive of Catalyst Corby. And I learned so much from him because he is just an amazing character, and he knew how to bring in the developers, the house builders, all the policy people. He found pots of money everywhere. He was just, he was, first of all, a truly honest character, passionate, driven. And also he had, what I think is really important, and that was rat cunning for understanding, how you duck and dive to get things done. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, personalities and everything else. And a couple of weeks ago, I organised for a group of people who were involved in the sort of regeneration of Corby in that period to come back and have a look at what had been done. And there's an area there called Priors Hall that Urban and Civic took over when the original developer went bust, unfortunately. And I'm so proud of that development and so proud of what they've done. And, they should be so rewarded for the care. And that's the difference. It's the care in, they were able to talk about the things they were doing with the community, the stonework they were using for the public realm. The guys who showed us around knew the nuts and bolts. They knew the quality of the playground and why they needed certain things and in the playground. And I'm going to contrast something with a couple of months ago. I went to a very big development in London, and all flash, great presentation. I mean, it was all singing and dancing presentation. And I asked a question about the actual specifics of one of the flats, and the guy who was giving the presentation said, "Oh, that's not my area." And I think that's a failing. It should be your area, because that's what you do. That's what we're here to look at, the homes you are delivering. Yeah. And I think that some people in positions of leadership in the built environment are too far removed from the end product. And I don't mean the envelope of the building. I mean, how do you live? How is your resident going to actually live in that unit? Yeah. And again, I saw something come through on my Instagram feed the other day, and one was a film with James Dyson talking about a new kitchen mop that had been Dyson have developed. And he spoke with such passion and the detail about how you get dirt off a floor and how they'd sort of cracked this problem. And I've searched everywhere trying to find an equal example from the built environment of somebody who is so passionate about the product that they're building and the innovation they've brought into the home. I mean, I haven't seen from volume house builders any innovation since my parents bought a volume home in the 80s.
Yeah.
So no one talks about, and again, pet peeve of mine, we still build homes and flats where no one can dry their washing. And by the way, a washer-dryer combo unit is not a solution because I don't think anybody has ever successfully used one of those. But do you know what I mean? If you took any Taylor Wimpey, Barrett Redrow, Persimmon, do the board and the senior leadership team spend time in those homes, and in the same way that, I don't know, the head of Jaguar Land Rover probably knows everything that's going wrong on a new edition car.
I might have told you this story before, but I'll tell it again for the benefit of the viewers and listeners. I remember, 25 years ago, I worked for the PLC house builders for 10 years, yeah? And that was never the plan to work for them for 10 years. I'd started out in development, and I started, after a few years, I realised actually what I didn't know and how complicated it was, and thought, right, I'm going to have to go and get a job with a big developer to get real deep knowledge and experience, yeah? So the plan was only to go there for a couple of years. I ended up stuck with them for 10 years for, they got me with the golden handcuffs and stuff. Anyway, and every time I went to leave, there was promotions and pay rises, and basically, it made it hard for me to escape. So remember, this is a PLC house builder, right? And I don't want to be easy for people to work it out. I'd just tied up a really big deal, yeah? I had to pick up the big boss from the airport and drive him to this site to go, because it was a really big one. It was big numbers, it had to be signed off by the chairman, basically. Anyway, picked him up from the airport. We were driving to the site. So we were driving through Luton Airport, right? So it wasn't my patch. So we were driving coming back to London, which was my patch. We were driving through a load of areas that I hadn't been before, right? We're driving down this road, and can see a development up in the distance, and you can see the flags and stuff like that. So it's obviously a new build development. As we were getting closer and closer, you could obviously see the colours and stuff like that. So we realised, it was one of ours, right? The firm I was working for. So as I was getting closer and closer, a bit like you, interesting, you telling the story, like going around sites with your dad. I mean, I'm like that with my kids, really. I'm like literally building sites all the time. As we're getting closer, we're obviously both looking at it, and he wouldn't have seen it before, because remember, he's the big boss with tens of thousands of homes and hundreds of sites all over the country, right? So as we're getting closer, we're both looking at it, sort of sussing it out and the rest of it. And actually, they'd done a nice job. It was obviously a conservation area. They were nice bricks, nice tiles, nice bit of detail and all the rest of it. And as we were getting closer and closer, I was looking at it and thinking, actually, that's nice. They've done a good job there, right? He's obviously looking at it. And then he says to me, God, I've spent too much money on that. And I was like, fucking hell, man. That was like basically the final straw. And I sort of like bit my tongue for a few seconds. And in the end, I said, are you fucking joking? And he said, oh, I'm not joking. What do you mean? They've obviously done a nice job there. Right, it's not just all about the money. When you build shit, people feel shit, people act shit, everything goes to fucking shit. Yeah. Right? And he said, well, I don't see it like that. I see it as the bottom line. And I was like, fucking hell. And that basically sums up the wrong attitude. So a couple of weeks later, I resigned again. Usual situation, pay rises, promotions, blah blah blah. And I basically said, no, look, that's it. I said, there's nothing you can possibly do that's going to make me fucking stay. That developer now, just in case people go sussing them out, working out who it is, that wouldn't be too difficult. They are actually a lot better. So to jump back to your other thing about, I think the sort of, chief executives and the senior management and stuff like that, they are now much more interested than they used to be in customer care and design and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, the problem, of course, with PLCs and stuff is, they got shareholders and the city to keep happy. And one final thing, just to see what you say about this, and this is a real pet peeve. Now, private equity investors and stuff like that, It's the worst possible thing for house building, in my opinion, because as much they can talk about ESG and all the rest of it, but in actual fact, all they really care about is fucking money.
So I don't see where always this idea that the shareholders' interests are not aligned with a great product. I mean, every other sector works on that. Why is it not the same for our industry? And if you look at actually, PRS, I think, has been very, very good for our sector. What that has done, I think the industry for a very long time, I'm talking about house building here, not commercial property in London. And actually, that's a really good example, because if you look at commercial property where people are building offices, the quality of those is generally very, very good, because people understand the typology. You live in it, so if you're running a commercial property company, you're going to live in and occupy an office. So, you've got a feel for the product, haven't you? But if you're building houses and you never go anywhere near it, and I mean, just on that, I mean, if you're a house building company, I don't know of any house builders who live in their own product. Okay, which is very unusual in any other business sector. If you produce cars, generally you drive that car. I'm sure Dyson has a Dyson at home, probably uses the hairdryer, but you know what I mean? You're feeling and you're getting a sense of what's working and what isn't. We have a sector where people produce houses but don't live in them. So they're never able to physically feel them and go that next time, on the next round, we've got to improve that iteration. It is down to leadership to show shareholders the way as well. That is the art of persuasion, of keeping so in the past, if you were building houses, it was build and dispatch. You build it, you sell it, and then really you've got no relationship after that. It's someone else's problem. And that happens with all sort of house sales. But I think with build to rent, suddenly the people who are building have to hold on to that property. They also have to have a relationship with the customer. And they are constantly talking to the customer and getting new customers, because that's the asset value. And so if you look at some of the innovation in terms of the design of the product, it's much better than often what you get in for sale homes, which is bizarre. Helen Gordon from Granger took me around a development in Canning Town a couple of years ago, which was amazing. Wonderful concierge, great area where you could have your dry cleaning dropped off and your parcels picked up and all of those sorts of things. The space was wide, lots of wardrobe space. They'd separated the design out so you could rent them for two people. There was a lot of thought went on into the actual design of the product. And that's the first time I saw product innovation in terms of the end result. I'm talking on volume. Obviously, I've been around all sorts of fabulous architects' houses, which are just off the scale, beautiful and beautifully tweaked and everything else. But I'm talking about the sort of volume house builders in terms of the innovation of the product that is produced each year. You don't see, come and look at this round, the 2025 house, look at all the innovation we've got in it. So, and there's nothing to stop you doing that. That doesn't cost that much money in the scale of what we're talking about. Your margins are not that tight. That because you look at the profits.
Or one of the problems, because and I've got to say they're way better than they were when I was with them 25 years ago, right? And there are some really good ones as well. Like in terms, Berkeley are probably the best. Part of the problem is, though, because they're all after the same sites, it is really all ends up being about land values and who can be top bid. And in order to get to be top bid, they are cutting costs and cutting their margins. And it's almost like a race to the bottom in some ways. So that is part of the issue. But it's also the reason that regrowing the SME house building sector is so important, because they are the people, their whole model, I can speak for myself really, or could be, or should be, their little niche is just doing good
innovative,
Absolutely.
fantastic stuff, you know?
You know, where I live, I've seen there's a company called Grace Homes who's done a little development outside of Brigstock, and really good looking homes. I mean, I haven't been through them, so I can't say I haven't done a tour of them yet. But, you know, the windows look large, good quality. They've got solar panels. You know, I'd be proud to live in one of those homes. I think they've done it really well. So there is good, you know, not everyone is bad, but the bigger companies, you cannot tell me that the big companies, the massive house builders, do not have the financial capability to be investing in research and development in a much greater way than they are.
Credit where credit's due. There are some that are better than others. I'll call a spade, right? Barclay are good. Persimmon and shit. Some of the other big ones, Taylor Wimpey and Barrett, do quite a lot in terms of research and stuff like that. So they're not all bad.
No, they're not. But I think the other thing I would say, and, you know, lots of people have a different view on this, I think the volume house builder stereotype has damaged the way we see development and building and new communities.
100%.
Because if you say to someone now, we need to build 1.5 million homes, all they see is you know, if you've driven along the motorway and you see these developments off the side of the motorway, that in the mind's eye of the average person, that's what they think 1.5 million is going to be.
Yeah.
They don't see many of those being flats or units in major cities.
Well, so do you know what? Sorry, the way planning policy is at the moment, that is what the 1.5 is going to be, because the stuff hasn't been done to create lots of the, you know, we don't need loads of big 500,000, 2,000, 3,000 home sites. Well, we need some of those as long as they're done right. But we need lots of, you know, 5s, 10s, 20s, 50s, and little developers doing really nice little stuff.
Exactly. And I hope you don't mind if I use this as a jump off to Don't Waste Buildings, which is this group that I'm involved with. And that is about, exactly as it says, don't waste buildings. So we know not to waste, you know, shopping bags or leftovers or anything like that. And yet we have this where we have to reach net zero by 2050, whether we like it or not. That is enshrined in law. That's an act of parliament. Whether that gets changed or not, the principle remains the same. We can't waste resources anymore. You know, that world is over. Yeah. Now, historic England say that they've got 600,000 homes that could be repurposed, or 600,000 buildings that could be repurposed as homes. Okay,
but 600,000.
600,000.
Historic England.
Yes, right across. They did a report, and right across the UK, there are 600,000 buildings that could be repurposed. The problem is, and that, in our view, is an absolute opportunity for SMEs, SME developers, to really lead on the retrofit market, because the retrofit market for housing does not suit the volume house builders, because they work from scratch. Yeah. However, again, we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot because there is VAT on retrofit. So, and as anyone who's ever renovated a house knows, when you start with one view in mind, you know, you pull something off the wall and you discover you've got a different problem. Yep. So it's a riskier option, but the government could change the financial instruments to make that possible. And that would do a number of things. First of all, bring homes into use in existing communities, so you don't have to go through that problem of building new towns everywhere. Also, it gives SMEs a great opportunity. It also gives skills right across the country as well. And you're not wasting the carbon budget by building. Now, we're not against any new building at all. What we're saying is use everything we've got sensibly and repurpose it. But you can't do that. You can't just keep campaigning to stop people pulling down buildings when it's not financially viable for developers to do so. So we have to have a situation where it is financially viable to reuse a building. And that means changing VAT and also bringing in incentives for reuse.
100% right. That's exactly what needs to happen. So just for, there's lots of people that watch this and
listen to this, and not all. Some of them are developers, some of them are sort of consultants and other people in the sector. There's a few planners based on, messages I get, people that are just interested and they know that we need more homes but don't really get how it all works, right? So there'll be lots of people out there. In fact, there's one guy in particular on LinkedIn. He's always, I will get him on here actually, banging on about what needs to happen, but he clearly doesn't get how it really works. Right?
Yeah.
So just for people, anyone else out there, including this bloke, I won't mention his name, from a private developer's point of view, this is a risky business. There's got to be enough profit in it to be worth your while to get the thing signed off, to borrow money, to basically stack up financially. Obviously, that's all hoping that the market doesn't go the wrong way and interest rates don't go up and materials don't go off and all the stuff that always happens, right? So there's got to be a reasonable profit margin in a deal to make it worth all of the hard work, and it is a lot of hard work, right? That's one thing. The other thing, of course, landowners need to be incentivized to sell. Yeah. So everything has got an existing use value. I started off doing conversions and refurbs and stuff like that years ago. I don't really do them anymore. The thing is, and remember, this is just for people out there that might not get how it all really works. Everything's got an existing use value. So let's just say it's an office building that's worth £1 million as an office building. Yeah. Now, if you want to convert it to residential, you're going to have to pay the landowner, the building owner, at least £1 million because they're not going to sell it for less than it's worth. And ideally, most of the time, you're trying to incentivize them to sell it, call it 20% premium, 1.2 million quid, right? So the 1.2 million quid is the bottom line. That's like the hurdle. That's the thing we're trying to beat in order to turn it into a deal, to make the landowner actually even want to sell. So obviously, when I look at a building or a bit of land, I've always got to think, what is it that's going to maximise that land value, i.e. create a premium over and above existing use value in order to incentivise the landowner to sell and make sure that I've still got a reasonable profit in it to cover the risk and make it worth my while, right? So basically, I'm always trying to make the development value pie as big as possible. Obviously, there are other considerations in terms of, you mentioned carbon and sustainability requirements and blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, at the end of the day, if I can't beat existing use value, you're never going to turn it into a deal, right? So that's why very often the only way super sustainable stuff happens is where you've got subsidised land and things like that. Every time I'm looking at a bit of land, anytime any sensible developer's looking at a bit of land, they've got to be thinking, what is it that's going to maximise the value of this land? And now, if it's converting the building, because I don't have to knock it down, and obviously there's a cost saving there, by knocking it down, I couldn't get significantly more square footage out of that site, or extending it, or putting a bit on the roof or whatever, then obviously that's what I'm going to do. So really, the point is, from a sort of development viability point of view, the question I and any other developer's always got to answer is, well, what's the most viable thing? Sometimes it's converting buildings, sometimes it isn't. And of course, as development costs continue to go up, and they've probably gone up 30-40% in the last couple of years, it's crazy. Stuff becomes less and less viable, particularly in lower value areas. Almost by definition, very often it's the lower value areas that really do need regenerating. So that's a very long way of agreeing with you and saying that absolutely, the getting rid of the VAT and having other sorts of subsidies and perhaps tax breaks and things like that is what absolutely needs to happen.
We really got to this point because, the retrofit sort of movement has been around for a long time. And Will Hurst, who is co-founder of Don't Waste Buildings, was probably one of the early pioneers in that world. And Will is or was the editor of AJ, Architects Journal, and is now the managing editor. But a lot of the major retrofit schemes were in high value areas because it makes it, exactly as you say, it makes sense. And when Will asked me to get involved, I was sort of thought this was great and, good thing and everything else. But then as you dig deeper, you realize how systematically broken our aspirations for certain things are with how the system works. So as I say, I was very naive. I didn't know net zero was law. I didn't know that. I thought it was an aspiration, but it is. It was brought in with Theresa May's government that we have to meet net zero by 2050. And so then you go, okay, great. Now, The built environment, which is everything, it's houses, it's commercial property, it's, everything, makes up for something like 66% of emissions and everything else. So we're a big contributor to the carbon use of the world, and that's the world over. So if we're such a big sector, what's the government's plan to get us to net zero? And then you sort of look around and there's no plan. There is no plan. So, okay, well, reuse of buildings, as everyone agrees, is a sensible way of saving carbon, embodied carbon. Nobody doesn't agree with that. There are lots of ways of measuring carbon, and I'm not the expert to talk about that. But essentially, and then people talk about life cycle and everything else. But if you come back to the basic understanding of, can you reuse something? That's a good thing to do. But it's more expensive to do it. And then, as you say, when you step outside of the major cities and the high land areas, it becomes almost loss-making. So who's going to do that? Right now, so as you see, you've got that side, you've got that agenda. Then along comes the government, and any government knew this, but we need a lot of houses. So how are you going to build 1.5 million homes? Now, it's going to be very, very difficult, first of all, even with the planning changes, to get communities on board to build 1.5 million in this parliament. Now, we're already through 1 year, I think. We're almost, the first year is almost gone, July. So you've got a lot of work to do, but we're not looking enough at existing buildings that can help with that solution. No one's going to do it if they lose money. It's just not going to happen. And that's not an unreasonable thing either for someone, particularly an SME or any organization has to make money. That's just how it works. So what we're trying to do is to get government to simplify policy so everybody knows. So people like you know exactly where you stand when you see a building. What are the rules around it for demolition or whatever? But also give some incentives to make it profitable for you to move forward. And then we go to the next level. I mean, we haven't been successful yet, by the way. We have 1,600 people who are on our LinkedIn group, which is fantastic. We run tours and we try and get MPs and local councillors to come and have a look at buildings so they can see what the art of the possible is. Because I think a lot of people think of when you reuse a building, it's going to be scrappy or bad or whatever. But there are so many fantastic examples of things that have been done so well. So we want people to see the art of the possible. But we are, and I think when I first got involved in Don't Waste Buildings, a lot of developer friends thought I was a blocker to things happening. We're not. We are absolutely on the side of developers. We want growth. We want success for all SME operators. And our other co-founder is a guy called Richard Nelson, who was the chair of the Property and Built Environment Group at the Institute of Directors. And of course, they represent hundreds, if not thousands, of small businesses or SMEs around the country. So that's a really important part of the narrative. They're in existing sites, they're in existing towns. All the towns around here, Peterborough, for example, there's lots of buildings could be reused. You've got town centre problems. If you got people back into the town centre, occupying town centres next to train stations, all of these good things. I mean, none of this is new. It's just you've got to take away the financial barriers. So that's what we're trying to achieve. As I say, we haven't been successful yet, but we're trying.
In terms of permitted development changes, that has absolutely opened up a whole load of potential conversion opportunities that were never there before.
Yeah.
Right. So again, just as hopefully a little bit of an interesting history lesson for people in terms of how it used to be in the olden days. Yeah. There were lots and lots of derelict, defunct, largely or wholly empty office buildings around. Prior to 2012, loads of office buildings in particular sitting around empty or half empty. Yeah. Now, in those days, if you went to submit a planning application to convert that to resi, I did get some after a big battle, but you would almost certainly be refused, and recent you would be refused. The most usual cited policy was loss of employment. Yeah, even though it wasn't employing anyone, it's an empty building. And interesting, actually, funny, the one I told you, the last one I'd done myself, which won a load of awards, that was the crux of the argument. Oh, it's an employment building, but hang on, it's empty. There is tons of supply of suitable buildings everywhere, and they're all empty or half empty. But planners said no, and it was crazy, right? It was ridiculous. So that's been one of the problems with the planning system. It still is in a lot of ways, actually very inflexible. No, it's an office building, it's an employment use, you can't convert it, right? Crazy, right? So very often you submit a planning application, make your case. Most of the time you'd win after a big battle. Then, of course, in 2012, you got Class O permitted development, which was the first real major change that all of a sudden made it super easy, actually, to convert offices to residential in most places. Yeah. Now, of course, what happened there is lots of, I'm going to say, speculators and people saw that, jumped on the bandwagon and thought, well, all of a sudden I can convert these buildings with fast-tracked, super quick planning. Then it wasn't really regulated very well at all. There were no space standards there. I mean, a whole real load of diabolical shit got created as a result of that in the first few years. And that was one of the reasons you were asking me before we went on air, actually, about some of my other stuff. That's one of the main reasons I actually started Millbank Land Academy in 2013, because I was getting really peed off with the amount of bad development and bad developers and I was seeing, and people not really understanding how to do stuff the right way and create good stuff. The requirements regarding PD have got tighter, so now it's much more difficult to do rubbish stuff, which is good. Obviously, that's how it should be. But then, of course, there's been loads of additional ones added on. Class, there's a Class E use class change that never used to exist before, lumping lots of the uses together. Class MA permitted development to convert lots of that stuff. So planning wise, central government planning wise, there has absolutely been loads of sort of game-changing permitted development rights. Yeah. I mean, I've got to say, personally, I don't necessarily love all of that stuff because it does still allow people to create some not very good. So the planning bit has definitely got easier. The viability thing obviously remains and will always remain. They at the end of the day, values in an area within reason, they are what they are. Costs will be what they will be. I think the planning policy actually does really push that stuff. Yeah. But there's PD for sticking additional stories on top. So that absolutely has been done. I guess the key issue will remain. Tax breaks and things like that would absolutely make a lot of that stuff more viable. But I suppose the problem is now, certainly the way the government is and tax in general, blimey, are they really going to be cutting any of that?
That's what everyone says. So, I mean, I think we are not the first group to raise VAT. If you, I've had the joy of trying to track down old reports and feasibility studies on removing VAT. And everyone says that the Treasury says they won't touch it with a barge pole. So you're absolutely right that the appetite for changing the financial instruments is very light. However, what we're trying to prove or what we're trying to show is that the value that you create by growing the economy, by providing homes, and it's not all buildings can be turned into homes. That's certainly not what we're saying, because so there was an office building in Birmingham that was done. It was called the Corner Block, which was repurposed by Bruntwood. It was an 80s building. That's the other thing. We're coming up now. I mean, we talk about 80s buildings like they're old buildings. That's really shocking because it doesn't feel old to me. But the even buildings that were built in the 2000s are coming to end of life already. They're not fit for purpose. If you demolish all of those buildings, the carbon and the cost is extraordinary. And yet if they can be reused for some other purpose, the building, the Corner Block in Birmingham was an 80s, not very exciting office building. I mean, we've all seen millions of them. No one's going to fight to keep it. It's not a significant building, but Bruntwood did an amazing job refurbishing that building, and it's now got first-class tenants. It's being used as an office building again, but it's been brought up to speed. And that's the campaign is, it's about housing, it's about office buildings. There's another group, a guy called Robert Wolstenholme, who runs Trilogy, who bought the Republic site in Tower Hamlets about 10 years ago. And these were 80s buildings that had been built as really disaster recovery space for Canary Wharf. They'd never worked. They'd never been sort of engaged as I mean, they were office buildings, but nobody hung around them. No one cared about them. The outside areas weren't looked after. And Robert and his team of Trilogy have, after quite a difficult time, renovated the buildings and turned it into Republic. And it's a further education campus. They have 15,000 people on that site every single day. The outside areas are amazing. The landscaping's incredible. They've got small cafes and owners and shops and all of that sort of thing. And he's brought that whole area to life. So the value is not just one thing. It's all of the value that we get out of reuse of buildings. Now, it could have easily been demolished and turned into something else. Thankfully, he was, a visionary and was able to go through that pain barrier. And there's numerous people like that.
What was the pain, just out of interest? You mentioned it was painful.
He'd be a good person to talk to, actually, because he's also doing a development up in Manchester. I think it's about things like bringing the building up to EPC ratings, making sure it's up to standard, the cost of retrofit on something like that, bringing up to standard. But they've done it in a phased way, which is working for them. I think they were doing it as originally it was going to be space for small businesses, and that didn't work. And then they've moved on to the further education. So the general sort of pain barriers that you go through, I think, as a developer. Also trying to get people out to that area, as sort of getting agents. I mean, you talked about it. We won't go on to agents here, but getting agents out of their comfort zone was quite an extraordinary thing as well. But if you're ever down in that area, I would recommend to anyone to go and have a look at it. It's just near East India Dockland Station, a fabulous development.
Got any other success stories?
It's actually just a beautiful building. Again, it's in London, but it's done by General Projects, who have reused the Heels building on Tottenham Court Road. And we did a tour there in the very early days of Don't Waste Buildings. And the reason we were so interested in doing that is because it sort of signifies Heels was a major department store, furniture store. So the floor plates are a particular type and everything else. But it's the idea of reusing these buildings into a different use when retail has changed so dramatically. Yeah. And every single town centre, I mean, again, Peterborough has the same problem. What do you do with these retail buildings but when everyone is saying, retail has changed or is dead, how do you reuse them? There is, and I haven't seen it yet, but I'm dying to see it, the Debenhams building in Bristol apparently has been turned into a skate park. So, it's those sorts of things. There's another building by Morrow and Lorraine. They're the architects that I understand. Again, we're doing a tour of it, which has been renovated into tennis, padel courts. Yeah, sort of big ping pong, isn't it?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
New tennis ping pong, I think they call it.
Exactly. We're doing a tour. We're going down to Bristol. We're doing Portsmouth. I've had conversations with people in Orkney. They have a lot of buildings. Again, they don't have institutional investors coming in. They have much, much smaller investors, but it's a thriving community in Orkney, and they need to reuse their buildings, and they've got to do it in the most sustainable way. What we're trying to do with Don't Waste Buildings is take people to all of these different places where you can see the art of the possible and also understand the blockages, because it's about the smaller communities that actually matter.
And I love it. And again, for me, my whole thing is about like SME developers and actually communities as well. So that whole, high streets, town centres, it's all so important. I mean, so many of them have gone down the pan for reasons we know about, and they are areas of massive opportunity. And do you know Alex Slagman?
Oh,
Save the High Street.
Right. No.
I'll introduce you.
That would be great.
He's a top guy. I'll get him on here as well. Actually, it's doing some really interesting stuff and has been for years. Actually,
what's been fantastic about Don't Waste Buildings is it. Just everybody wants to get involved. I mean, we've had in fact, I'm not even sure if anyone has said no. When people find out what we're about, I think it just really resonates with people in a very personal way. I mean, there are also community groups who are so passionate about reusing their buildings, and there's lots of studies to say that even an ugly building, if you know it, if it's part of your town, you love it more than a new build. So it's about sort of memory as well. And I don't want to get all woo-woo about it, but it's part of our sort of knitted history. And ugly buildings can be turned into something, quite sensational. So everything's got the opportunity to be reused as long as there's some imagination. And as you say, it's all about the viability, making sure it can make some money.
I'd love to show you my latest interesting new build scheme. I'd love to show you my last interesting conversion scheme, and I'd love actually to get more involved and see some of these other things that you're trying to highlight, because I like it and I think it's important stuff.
We've got sort of buy-in from right across the industry, so developers, investors, policymakers, everybody is on board. Then everyone understands, if you're in this industry, that the financial viability side on reuse of buildings is crucial to cracking that code. And also the policy side. I mean, that's really important. I think a lot of local authorities just don't have the bandwidth at the moment to get to know what sort of clarity they need to give developers in terms of reuse as well. So, and we're all volunteer. We have no money. We don't, we're not a formal charity or anything like that. But it's a movement that is growing every single day.
Where can people go to check you out?
don'twastebuildings.org. I think
we'll find it and I'll post it and we'll put it out.
And actually, if you're on Spotify or anywhere like that, put in Don't Waste Buildings. We have a song, a little children's song by a guy called Johnny Awesome, who wrote a song for us, and it's very cute. And if you're doing any social media posts about buildings you want to be reused, you can add that as your backing track.
And we'll see if we can play that on the way out.
That'd be great.
All right,
Thank
lovely.
you.
Thanks, Leanne.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together we can all help create better places, spaces and homes, and a much more beautiful world.
We could make a paddle court for your gran,
or an 80s bar, or a cinema. Let's save them if we can.
Don't waste buildings. Let's do buildings up, not tear them down. Yeah, that's the plan. You know, if Elvis was alive, he'd tell you, don't waste buildings, man.